good. So I'm glad to see you all. I know we're still expecting, let's see, Lucas, do I see you on screen? Oh, there you are. Yeah. Hi, Lucas.
Yeah, I'm
great.
here. Hello.
Yeah, I had seen you come into the waiting room. So great. Good to see you all. I think that it would not be time badly spent to have another round of self-introductions just so we can once again kind of get faces to names to profiles. And I won't begin with Emily, even though you're the upper left corner of my screen. I'll begin with Jiwen. If you'd like to just, to kind of reintroduce yourself, say what your program is and what you're interested in, just so that we can begin to get a sense of, who we are. You could begin, Jiwen.
Hi, my name is Zhiwen. I'm from International and Regional Studies, specialized in Chinese study, and my interest is performers. And I'm physically now in Ann Arbor. Yeah, that's all.
You're in Ann Arbor. That's good.
Yeah.
And I think I can't remember if you told me which city you're from.
Oh, I'm from Xinjiang province.
Xinjiang.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. It's great to have you on the course. Okay, let us move on to Lucas.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lucas. I'm the undergrad of the class. I'm a philosophy major at Michigan, as well as the neuroscience program. And yeah, I'm in Muskegon with my parents right now because there's no reason to be in Ann Arbor. Everything's shut down. It's just cheaper to live here. Yeah, I'll be applying to like grad schools to do a PhD in philosophy next cycle. That'll suck.
Cool. You're probably aware that the health department asked all students to stay home about a week ago. Stay home meaning if you're in Ann Arbor, just stay in your residence hall or in your apartment. So you're not missing very much by being in Muskegon. Chandler.
Hello, I'm Chandler, as you can tell from the name tag. I'm a second year economics PhD student. I really like philosophy, but I also like macroeconomics and public finance, which is like taxes and stuff. So
everyone loves taxes. Cool. Okay, Margot. Greetings.
Hi, I'm Margot. I would be a first year in the PhD program in philosophy, but I deferred because of COVID. So I'm just kind of vagabonding in various seminars right now. I did my undergrad at Brown in Rhode Island. I'm broadly interested in sort of epistemology type questions. I'm sort of interested in what philosophy of science was 35 years ago, which is now sort of part of epistemology. Questions about explanation and theory choice and things like that. And then I have a secondary interest in feminist philosophy.
Well, there's a good overlap actually between feminist philosophy and philosophy of science also. So that's cool. And
I took Laura's class. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I took Laura's class, or I sat in on Laura's class last semester, which was just like a philosophy of science seminar. It's kind of billed as a philosophy of science seminar, but it was about values in science. And there's a lot of feminist philosophy of science. It was a really good course.
Excellent. And where are you located now?
I am currently located in Savannah, Georgia, but I grew up in California. I'm here. My partner's a journalist, and he's working here. So that's where we are right now. And I'm a bread baker right now, which is really cool.
Oh, that is pretty cool. Oh, that's right. You mentioned the bread baking. Okay, Jun Chao.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jun Chao. So I'm a first year PhD student in sociology. So I got my BA and MA in sociology from China, where I also tried to get a minor in philosophy, but yeah, anyway, it failed. So I only have a BA in sociology. That's another story. So yeah, so I came to the US in 2018, 2 years ago, to go for a master degree in East Asian study at Harvard, and moved to Michigan last year. So I'm broadly interested in social stratification and political sociology, and also as a lifetime sociology student, I'm quite interested in how to judge and evaluate the quality of sociological theory. So that's why I chose this course. So,
So there's a really interesting question about the history of sociology, 20th century history of sociology in China. And as you know, and probably several others may know as well, sociology was interrupted as a discipline for, I don't know, 20 years or so, from 1956 through the end of the Cultural Revolution. And as I understand it, because Chairman Mao was of the opinion that sociology had to do with social problems, and China no longer had social problems, and therefore sociology was no longer needed. But of course, I think we all understand that sociology is not just about problems, it's about change in an unpredictable world. And so I find the topic of sociology in China today a really, really interesting topic. It's also, well, it's something I've thought about quite a bit. So it's really great to have you here in the course. Did you say Fudan is where you were undergrad?
Yes, at Fudan. So it's very interesting. It's the most US style sociology department in China.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a rather smooth transition to the US context, but yeah, there are some words of methodology in contemporary Chinese sociology about which is the right way to do social science. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
like decades ago in the US. Yeah.
So in 2005, I had the invitation to spend 6 weeks at Peking University, Beida, it's called there. Beida means, I think, Great University of Beijing. I introduced a new term called Mishta.
Oh, I know that institute. It can collaborate. Yuxie was is the major proponent for that. Also.
Yeah. Well, this was right at the beginning. In fact, it was before the Michigan Beijing collaboration had begun. So I guess I was technically the first professor to spend 5 or 6 weeks at Beida.
Yeah, we can talk about that later. So
yeah, I'd like to.
Peking is the major opponents Fudan has. So our two departments have direct opposite philosophy. So yeah, we can talk about that later.
Well, I would like, that's really excellent. It's very relevant to the philosophy of social science. How does the discipline define itself, and how are political and social and other kinds of influences relevant to the development of a discipline, including international prestige? And anyway, so it's interesting. It's great to have you here in the course. Okay, Emily, you look as though you've put your bowl aside.
Yeah, I have, after some scoffing. Yes, so I'm from the education department. As I said, so my undergrad degree was in chemistry. I then became a chemistry teacher. I then studied philosophy part-time. I did an MA in political philosophy. And then through work, I did an MA, or an MSc actually, in teacher education. And then I realized that I clearly needed to actually study full-time because it was becoming highly inefficient. So I decided to apply to do a PhD. And I guess, one of the things so I'm in my first year, one of the things I've really been struck by is just the enormous difference in the university as an institution between the UK and the US, especially the experience of what it means to be a doctoral student. It's just an enormous transition for me.
Could you put your finger on one or two important pieces of that?
Well, I mean, my experience in the UK is relatively specialized because because I went to a collegiate university, you like live in colleges, so you live in like very, very small communities, and your academic work is in a department. But you have like, so for example, so just some social things that I've noticed that are very different. I can't imagine, I really don't mean this in an offensive way, but I can't imagine calling my professors Professor so-and-so, Professor so-and-so, because even as undergraduates, that was completely taboo. Everyone called everybody by their first name. There's a sort of an idea of, yeah, there's a kind of, I don't know, there's a different sense of how hierarchy should be represented.
Mm-hmm.
Classes are very, very different. Like as a doctoral student in the UK, you wouldn't take any classes. You would just do your research.
Mm-hmm.
And so I find that the demands very, very different. You know, I had a couple of classes last semester where I was required to submit hundreds of tiny things, all of which were marked, which I thought was just crazy, because when I was an undergraduate, I had work marked once a year. You know, that was it. The only thing that was ever marked was my exams at the end of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else was done by us.
Really interesting.
Really, really different setup. But I imagine that's probably the extreme because of the university that I went to. There will be other universities which have a you know, more you know, more in-betweeny sort of model. But yeah, I'm still kind of struck by the differences in the norms and expectations.
Great. Ilun, you said a few words a minute ago, but you didn't really introduce yourself. So why don't you go ahead too?
Yeah, sure. I'm Ilun from also another first-year student in sociology, PhD student, and I'm broadly interested in social theory, social movement, contentious politics, and political economy. So yeah, I'm generally interested in like how can we engage the question, what the social is, with empirical work. So that's why I took this class. And yeah, and like I said last time, I've actually wrote a MA dissertation 2 years. I guess I finished it 2 years ago, and like which is about like how people mobilize and like about how the way people protest change over time in the past 2 to 3 decades in Hong Kong. And basically I engaged the theory by Tilly to explain why the case of Hong Kong show a different pattern, a slightly different pattern from what Tilly discussed about England back in like 17th century, the 18th century.
And have you read the book that we'll be reading part of, Dynamics of Contention, McAdam, Tarot, Tilly?
Yeah. And I really like the approach. I haven't got I'm still wrestling with the idea of the dynamic that they talk about, but I really like the piece, and also the one that we read last week, the reflection by McAdam. Yeah, so
Right.
pretty cool.
Right. Oh, that's good. That's really cool. And it's really cool that that's the kind of research that you're interested in doing also. So it's interesting to kind of do this again today. I'll stop this part of our meeting today in just a minute, but tomorrow morning, extremely early because of the time shift, I'm participating in a conference in Kerala in India, which has a left-wing government. And the government is running this really marvelous conference on the future of Kerala. What, kind of what sort of changes Kerala should be planning for now. Kerala, by the way, had an outstanding experience, a really globally noteworthy experience in terms of its reaction to the COVID epidemic. And I bet one or two of you would be able to guess right away why Kerala's experience may have been better than the rest of India. Anybody have a theory about why that might be? Do anybody have any association with Kerala, the state of Kerala? Yeah, well, then you won't have much of a theory. It's historically, it's been a state with a very high level of well-being for its poorest people. It's had it hasn't always been governed by the left, but it's had a strong state government commitment to the well-being, the welfare of the poorest people of Kerala. And it's kind of a Amartya Sen's theories, but put into practical law and policy and government programs. I visited Kerala 4 or 5 years ago, visited tiny little factories which were established to help women move from destitution to, decent paid jobs in Kerala, making things like coconut derivatives and umbrellas. And it was just really very, very interesting. But anyway, the upshot is that Kerala's COVID experience was positive, partly because they reacted within days of the first case. But then secondly, they reacted not just at the medical side, but also at the social provisioning side. They understood immediately that an epidemic isn't just about health, it's also about deprivation of income, food, and other forms of social security. And the government of Kerala was very quick in establishing, kind of rice baskets and an ability to provide provisioning for its whole population. The upshot is its death rate, at least for the first 6 or 8 months of the epidemic, was noticeably lower than the rest of India. Anyway, the upshot is that tomorrow morning I'll be talking about on a panel on the future of higher education in Kerala, talking about the value and importance of international collaboration. So Emily, some of your comments about differences between UK and US universities, that's actually kind of relevant to the talk I'm planning to give tomorrow. It's a very short talk, but I've put an inordinate amount of time into trying to figure out what I can say that might be useful. So today, we're, in a sense, we're beginning with the real content of the course. And I wouldn't want you to have the wrong impression. You've read a fair amount of material on rational choice theory, and then critique of rational choice theory. And you've read James Coleman, who is really noteworthy to the couple of people who've done sociology, as one of the very few sociologists who takes a rational choice approach to traditional problems of sociological research. So you might imagine that the philosophy of social science, which we're going to kind of construct through this course, is somehow a rational choice theory of sociology, rational choice theory of the social sciences. But that's not accurate. So I wanted to disabuse you of that fear, partly because you might say, well, if that's the case, I don't want to be here. I don't want you to have that sense of disappointment. It's actually a cognate idea. You can see what the parallel is. The cognate idea is that from the start, I'm kind of putting it forward to you that we can really think about the social world best if we think from an actor-centered point of view, an actor-centered point of view. And when you think about the greats of, the great sociological theorists of the past 100 or 150 years, you think of Durkheim, you think of Marx, you think of Weber, you think of sociological theorists who thought big. They thought very macro. Now, it's true that Weber also thought micro, but Durkheim and Marx, particularly Marx talking about the mode of production and very high level, persistent, causally important social structures. There has been a presumption within sociology, within the social sciences, that sociology has to do with macro scale things, social structures, very large, durable, normative structures, ideologies, systems of knowledge, these kind of very high level macro sorts of entities. Ilun, I really liked what you had to say about social contention, because it's a good segue to understanding that we may want to talk about the capitalist mode of production, or we may want to talk about the world trading system. We may want to talk about these, in fact, we do want to talk about these high level social entities and structures. But when I advocate to you to kind of orient your brain around the idea of an actor-centered approach, it is to suggest that all social constructs, all social entities, all social processes and forces and imperatives and movements, that one way or the other, they're all constituted by living human beings in specific historical, institutional, cultural, and normative circumstances. So in a sense, part of what I mean to suggest to you is that if you just kind of studied Marx's thinking about historical materialism or about economics, and you thought, wow, I can have a whole science of the macro structure of the modern world. Well, what I'm kind of suggesting is, no, it would not be a good science, because we need to have a better understanding of the disaggregations, the more granular ways in which processes which we may identify at a macro level, the more granular and eventually the micro foundational ways in which those processes are embodied in individual actors with an asterisk. The thing about rational choice theory that you've seen both in terms of a kind of general presentation from Green and Shapiro, and also from a lot of critique that you read for today, rational choice theory is very deliberately and specifically anti-historical, anti-contextual. It really wants to take the actor out of institutions, out of context, and to have a very abstract description of the decision-making of the actor. What I'm proposing is a way of understanding the social world which understands that social events, processes, forces, structures, high-level entities, that they are all constituted by socially situated, socially constituted human individuals. That's what I mean by an actor-centered approach to the social world. So, Yilun, when you refer to the particular pathways of development of protest and mobilization in Hong Kong, if you took an old-fashioned kind of first wave theory of revolution, got a book right here on my desk that I'll be reviewing shortly, a new book on revolution. There are many theories of revolution. But if you had an old-fashioned theory, you would say, well, contention and discontent and mobilization for revolution, it just arises kind of naturally. It's part of historical materialism, just comes up. What Tilley and people in the politics of contention field of study over the past 30 years have made so clear to us is that contentious politics is itself highly contingent, that human individuals are forming collaborations, they're forming parties, they're forming grievances, they're being strategic as individuals and strategic as groups. And the way in which contention unfolds, whether it's in Gdansk, Poland in 1980, or it's in Hong Kong, 2019, 2020, that the conduct of that big social process, in some ways, Gdansk, 1980, and Hong Kong, 2018, 2019, those were both kind of earth-shaking social developments, but each of them needs to be understood in terms of the kind of the micro circumstances within the context of which mobilization, activization, the movement for individual ship workers to go from a sense of, I really don't like the communist government and the way that it's handling beef prices, but what can you do? that would be a kind of quiescence, moving from that level of discontent to the level that says, when Lech Walesa calls for solidarity, I'm ready, I'm there, I'm ready for a social movement. That process is one that we can disaggregate. We can kind of try to understand. And that is exactly, if we were on campus, I would point out the window at this point, because the room I always teach this course in, you can see the school across the street, which is where Tilley's Center used to be located. There's an elementary school, which is part of the Institute for Social Research now. It's an old school. Take a look at it next time you're on campus, if you ever happen to be on campus again. I don't know if any of us ever will, but maybe we will. But in that school, Tilley did a lot of the work that Yi Lun was referring to, and has continued, well, he's deceased now, but he continued to do that work for another 30 years. And what it had to do with is trying to figure out the historically situated, institutionally situated, normatively situated, culturally situated individuals who wound up being followers, leaders, reluctant advocates, fellow travelers. In other words, just a really wide range of motivation and processes of mobilization. It's that effort to move between the macro and the micro, or between the high level social, profoundly interesting social process of revolution or civil war, or for that matter, crazy Proud Boy takeover of the US Capitol. So high level events which are occurring, and then we would like to be able to disaggregate and discover the forms of organization and ideology and communication through which individual social actors are brought to play a role, and sometimes a predictable role, sometimes a completely unpredictable role. So in other words, what I think the first kind of premise for this evening is the idea that an actor-centered approach to the social sciences is not a de-socialized approach, it's rather a disaggregated approach. In a way, it's kind of recognizing that social change, social process, social causation works through factors that we identify at the macro level, factors like normative structures, cultural structures, practices. An idea that Tilley introduced early in his career was the idea of repertoires of contention. Elin, I'm sure that's an idea that's familiar to you. Would you like to explain that idea just for a second? What is a repertoire of contention?
Yeah, in my, I actually engage with the idea of repertoire of contention or collective action. So like, this is, so like Tilley, in my understanding, that Tilley borrowed the idea from some theatrical performance. So like, it's like a, it's an idea of collection. So he put different kind of collective actions into under the category of repertoire, and to describe how there are like different kind of way of doing of different kinds of collective actions.
Mhm.
So like for instance, so the concern for him is to explain the change and the stability of it over time in when dealing and capitalism and modern state rises. For yeah, I guess that's
That's
for,
very good. It's very good.
yeah.
And his view, you had mentioned his treatment of English contention and French contention. Chuck Tilley, most of his historical research was on France, but he also wrote about English revolution, English contention. But one of the things which he put forward was the idea that in different kind of centuries and periods of contentious politics in France, the issues were often the same issues. It might be you know, wheat prices or bread prices or, you know, bad landlords or whatever, you know, the kinds of things that peasants and working class people are oppressed by, but that the ways in which they mobilized and they expressed resistance were very different. They had a different bag of tricks to make use of in the 18th century and the 19th century. If you had one visual image, I don't know that you do have one, but let's say you might have one in the revolutions of 1848 in France. Anybody have any association with the revolutions of 1848 in Paris? Kind of what literally happened in the streets in Paris? There's one particular action that I'm thinking of, which happened everywhere in Paris. And it's described by Tocqueville in vivid detail, beautifully described in a book called Recollections of 1848. What I'm thinking of is barricades, the tearing up of the cobblestones of the street and building barricades over the streets. Well, you might say that's a military strategy by the working class, or by, oh, by the way, the working class. A little critique here. What am I talking about when I say the working class of 1848? Is that a concept we can understand, or does it need to be problematized?
The working classes are just the people not part of the leisure class.
Okay, so it might include glassmakers and daily workers who actually put the cobblestones in the street, and people who tend to the horses. So just kind of ordinary people. That's one possibility. By the time we get to the same period of time, but in Great Britain, and Engels's great book about the conditions of the working class in England, his description of Manchester and Birmingham factories, at that point, the kind of stereotypes that we have about working class people, those stereotypes have a sociological reality, which didn't apply to Paris, in 1848. So when I used that phrase, I'm self-criticizing here, when I said the working class tore up the streets and made barricades, well, a good historian would say, no, professor, or if we are more Emily oriented, we would say, no, Dan, you're creating a construct that didn't exist at that time. There were many different strata, and we still needed to do the E.P. Thompson thing, the making of the working class. The making of the French working class still remained to do. Is E.P. Thompson, is that a familiar name to any of you? Edward Thompson. He's one of my personal heroes, I guess, but he wrote a major book called The Making of the English Working Class in the 1960s or 70s. And it is, I think it's very relevant to this line of thought about an actor-centered approach to social change, to the social world, because he takes it very specifically not for granted that the working class has always been with us, that we can always identify the working class. Rather, he kind of goes through in detail in English history the formation from specialized people who did saddles or shoes or shirts to a forging of a larger identity as workers, as wage workers. And so this book, The Making of the English Working Class, is actually a major contribution to collective action, to the understanding of collective action and contentious politics. In a way, it's a nice compliment to Chuck Tilley, because it too is a disaggregative kind of book. He does not presume that we know what the working class is. Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
I just have a very, very mild little anecdote, which I thought I would share about the characterization of the working class in Britain, which is a society which I'm sure you know still sees itself as having a massive class problem, very large class divides. So where sort of, I can't remember what the exact stats are, but whereas like about 80% of Americans identify as middle class. That's not the case in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I remember going to a talk at a philosophy festival, which, as you can imagine, has a rather bourgeois identifying sort of crowd, and the speaker said, so working class people like us, and you could see everybody in the audience sort of looking around and saying, working class people like who? We've all paid an awful lot of money to sit in these seats in this very pretentious tent. And he sort of looked at people and he said, do you have to work to earn a living? You know, do you have to work to survive? And sort of people nodded yes. And he's like, so you're working class then? And carried on. It was very funny.
Mm-hmm. So Marx had a term for, I don't want to give you the impression that Marxism is my conceptual categories, but we just kind of started with the development of contention and resistance. But labor aristocracy, I guess we professors, if we're in the working class, we're in the labor aristocracy end. We're well paid, we're well protected in our conditions of work. And mostly we don't have to worry about getting our little arms stuck in a horrible machine that will rip it off. So what's the line of thought here? The line of thought here is that actor-centered sociology or actor-centered social science or actor-centered history is, in one sense, it is kind of individual oriented, but it is not reductionist, and it is not, it doesn't try to take the social out of social explanation. Rather, it tries to understand how social causes and social processes get ramified and developed in particular conditions and circumstances. I think that it's really interesting to, I'm thinking about post-World War II communist regimes in Eastern Europe, and the fact that these regimes, East Germany, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, these were not happy places for, they were not a worker's paradise. But in many countries, there were not organized resistance movements, and then in some countries there were. So in Poland, there was a pretty extensive, pretty continuous, kind of up and down resistance movement from the 60s into the 70s, the 80s, the Solidarity movement. And so an actor-centered approach would ask the question, what was happening in Poland? And then maybe more specifically, what was happening in Warsaw, and what was happening in Gdansk, and what was happening in Krakow? In other words, how does it disaggregate? What were the organizations? What role did the Catholic Church play in resistance organization and mobilization in Poland? Well, that would be to take an actor-centered approach to the question of social resistance, political resistance in Eastern Europe, trying to then have a good Tilley-like explanation of how it is that resistance was pretty effective. There was a lot of repression, but it was pretty effective in Poland, and had kind of different levels of effectiveness and persistence in other countries. That would be to take an actor-centered approach to resistance to Stalinist dictatorship, let's say. If we were to ask, Emily, your example is an intriguing one. How is it that either in the US, where no one looks at himself or herself as working class, or in Great Britain, where lots and lots of people do, what are the— I
do. Like, I'm from a working class family, yeah.
Go ahead, say it.
I do, I identify as working class.
Yes.
So yeah, lots of people do. I don't really sound working class. I don't fit the stereotype, but I identify that way, yeah. So,
and then the actor-centered question, the kind of cultural context question, would be, what are the mechanisms which in France lead to one kind of identity of working people, in England or Great Britain, another identity of working people, and in the United States, a third identity. In India today, what accounts for the uprising of farmers? The protest and resistance movement of farmers today is the most powerful resistance which the hateful populist regime of the BJP has faced to date. And it was kind of out of the blue. So the kind of question, what I'm really wanting to intrigue you by is the idea that an actor-centered approach to history and sociology is actually a very powerful approach, because what it's asking basically is for a particular historical setting, for a particular time in history, a particular place in history, what were those surrounding circumstances which led some people to be, ready to be a part of the solidarity movement in Poland, other people to be ready to be potential leaders, even though it might mean prison for a very long period of time. What were those circumstances which led to mobilization and the emergence of a large social movement? Isn't that an intriguing, powerful question? And isn't it, I guess I'm putting it to you as a matter of intellectual assessment, isn't this a good way, a better way really, of understanding historical change than what Marx has to say in historical materialism? That there's just kind of an inevitable dialectic, and that there's class conflict and eventually conflict between the forces and relations of production. I mean, this is such a boring story, really. Yeah, go ahead, Marco. You're muted.
No, we can't hear you.
Yeah, then we got your voice. Nope. It must be the headphones. Yeah, we'll give you a minute. Yeah, you can mess with the headphones, and we'll come back to you when you're ready, so you don't feel on the spot.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we do.
Oh, this is fabulous. Okay, sorry, learning curve here. Okay, so I had a question about sort of the relationship between actor-centered theories and the sort of like culture that you were talking about before, and sort of how we're supposed to think of them as explanations, especially how we're supposed to think of actor-centered explanations as different than the sort of macro explanations you were just talking about. Mm-hmm. So basically my question is this supposed to be sort of a reductionist approach? So for example, some people will say that chemistry explanations all reduce to physics explanations, or that biology explanations reduce to chemistry explanations. And giving that explanation sorry?
I said they're wrong, but yes, they do.
Yeah, so that's like kind of controversial, but I think that's like us. We can understand why they would think that. Mm-hmm. And like that's probably how most of us learned chemistry and biology in like middle school or whatever. That's how I learned it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I should probably give a better example of reductionist explanation.
It's a very clear statement, actually, because it's a very common scientific strategy of explanation. We explain the higher level unit in terms of the properties and laws and causal properties of the constituents. So I'm going to hesitate a little in agreeing that it's reductionist as opposed to disaggregative or granulated explanation, but I'm agreeing with the strategy. What we are basically asserting is that we explain the emergence of resistance in Poland in 1980 by discovering the cultural factors, the ideological factors, the economic material factors, the leadership factors that were present in the shipyards, in Gdansk, et cetera, in the context of which large numbers of workers were prepared to be mobilized. They had the thought processes which allowed them to say, not only, I'm willing to tweet that solidarity is my preference. They didn't have Twitter in those days. You probably knew that. But not just a meaningless statement, I support solidarity, but a powerful statement of personal engagement. I'm going down and demonstrating with 100,000 of my fellow ship workers. That transformation is what led to the emergence of a massive civil resistance movement that we now refer to as solidarity. And it's those kind of lower level factors, which I'm saying an actor-centered approach is trying to identify and then use as explanation. So in a sense, it is like your physics to chemistry example. It's not reductionist though, in the sense that I'm kind of dancing around a methodological controversy which the social sciences have had to mess with since Weber, which is methodological individualism, which is reductionist in the sense of saying social facts can be reduced to individual facts. So we derive social facts from individual facts. And the picture that I'm offering to you doesn't say that. Rather, it says socially situated individuals give rise to larger social facts, but it's social all the way down. And that really requires, the philosophers among you, requires some analysis. What does that mean? Am I just begging the question by saying Catholicism in Poland affected Polish workers and gave them greater courage to be, I'm just making it up at the point. I don't know that anybody maintains this, but that Catholicism as a religious influence had influence on the individual workers. It gave them kind of moral, mental resources, which made them more ready to be mobilized. That would then be a causal factor, but how does it work? Well, I can't assert it works like fairy dust, like kind of a distributed secret sauce social influence. Rather, if I'm advocating for an actor-centered sociology, then I have to understand the workings of Catholicism also in this disaggregated way. But that's not hard, actually. It's kind of straightforward. How is, in fact, I'll ask you as an exercise, imagine we have a blackboard. The economists in the room can imagine stuff like this. Imagine we have a blackboard. How would you give an account, an actor-centered account of the working of Catholicism in a town in Poland influencing political behavior? Can you give me just a little sketch of an actor-centered approach? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Chandler, go ahead.
Yeah, so an actor-centered approach. So you could look at, if you had like religion data, so look at the Catholics versus non-Catholics and maybe some measure of political action and see if there is a relationship between, Catholic Orthodox believers and some other religious believers and political action, and then do some statistics.
Okay. So you could do that kind of almost experimental or quasi-experimental inquiry. But if what I were asserting is Polish Catholicism influenced people in their villages, how does that influence work? Well, it's kind of straightforward. Mom and dad were themselves influenced. So there's familial influence. There's the fact that the priest of the village is himself an influential character. So I go to the Polish Catholic school and I learn not only the reading religious material, but also I absorb some values. In other words, it isn't that hard to tell kind of a local story of how individuals acquire a particular cultural framework, a cultural, religious, normative framework, which is different from the one that the French Catholic may have gotten. So I would never want to assert Catholicism is the same kind of influence in France, Romania, and Poland. Rather, I would want to say, we need to investigate. We need to do some ethnography and see how Catholicism worked in the Polish village and in the Romanian village and in the French village. In other words, it's disaggregation all the way down, but it's also concrete social relationships It's why I put in front of you last time the idea of methodological localism. It's just an umbrella phrase for the idea of the socially constituted actor who is also socially situated. Those are two really important ideas, socially constituted and socially situated. Socially constituted means something kind of obvious, which rational choice theory does not get. Each of us, Juen, Lucas, Margot, Junchao, Emily, and Dan, I didn't name everybody, but it's true of everybody. We all have come with frameworks of value orientation, cognitive orientation, racial and gender orientation. You know, we've learned how to see each other as men and women, as racially distinct groups, as nationally distinct groups. We've come with stereotypes, right? I mean, this is kind of familiar stuff. And where does that come from? It comes from a socialization process, which is itself locally embodied. So Chandler's own personal history, but it's not just personal. It's not that Chandler's next door neighbor had a completely different experience, and so he came out completely different. There are obviously differences, but if you grow up in Illinois, as I did, you get some ideas about race that you don't get if you grow up in Alabama or if you grow up in New York City. So there, in other words, we can do empirical investigation of where these mental frameworks of action and thought and analysis and perception, where those frameworks come from. That's what I mean by socially constituted. So we're not a blank slate. We are already socially formed. And then the socially situated part is, I am a tenured professor and I live and work within a set of institutional arrangements. And there are certain things I'm empowered to do. And there are certain things I'm restricted from doing. And there are certain opportunities that I have. So I have access to research funds, which means I'm incentivized to, travel to, I would have gone to Kerala if only I could travel to Kerala tomorrow, but I can't. But because the research funds are there, it's something I would have done. Not that I would have missed this class. I would have gone, 9 p.m., flown straight to Kerala. But the social situation is, what are the opportunities which exist within my institutional setting? What are the rules, and what are the values which are associated with, being a part of a certain institution? So if you belong to a labor union, and the union has some positive values, like, stand up for your fellow worker, and don't necessarily trust everything that management says. That might be a rule that is mentioned. Well, that would be what I'm referring to as being institutionally situated, or being socially situated, being located within a set of institutional arrangements. But there again, we've got to ask the same question. I was asking, how did Chandler get his particular ideas about race and gender and, what's decent treatment, what's not decent treatment, your normative cultural mental framework. We now have a little bit of a story about how that happened, but likewise, we can ask the question, how do the institutions of the university, how are they embodied in an actor-centered world? And it's what I would, there's a phrase that Coleman introduces. I don't think it's in the readings that you did, but it's the idea of house of cards theory of institutions, that it's kind of mutually supporting facts that everyone in the university has a role somewhere, and they are all subject to feedback, both positive feedback and negative feedback. And the structure as a whole has a certain, kind of stability as a consequence of the fact that the accounting department and the president's office and the dean's office and the travel administrator, they've all got responsibilities that are defined by the region's bylaws. So the bylaws exist, the roles and responsibilities of various parties exist, and those roles have been designed so as to ensure compliance with the most important university rules. In other words, we can tell a story about how the institutions of the university or the institutions of local law are enforced and embodied in an actor-centered way. Margot, I think you were flashing your hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I really like the example of the Catholic Poles in their village. I think it really illustrates sort of the question that I was trying to get at, which is sort of about like what's the explanatory role of these macro concepts supposed to, like what is their explanatory role supposed to be? If we can give all of these explanations in terms of the individual choices, you can give a story about, like one version of the story is like Catholicism gave the working class the strength to like stand up, and the other version of the story is you know, Jan. I don't know if Jan's a Polish name. I knew a Polish guy named Jan. Jan's parents embodied these, not even these values embodied. I don't know, you can give this like super individualistic explanation for why Jan decided to quit his job and march in the street that makes no reference to Catholicism or solidarity, but it does sort of seem intuitively like these macro concepts have some explanatory value. So my question is, according to the actor-centered approach, do they have any explanatory value? And if so, where does it come from?
So one part of your question is, how would you empirically support the idea that Jan's Catholic identity, his Catholic history, was an important part of his motivation? How would you support that? And Chandler offered a little bit of a, kind of a design study that a PhD student would do. He'd go to the village and he would see whether the practicing Catholics were more engaged in solidarity movement than the non-practicing, let's say. In other words, we could do some empirical research. So that's one part of the answer. But the other part of the answer is one which, it's one reason why I really admire the work of McAdam, Tarrow, and Tilley, and that is their determination that social explanation requires discovery of causal mechanisms. So if the claim is that to be mobilized, a person needs to have X, Y, and Z characteristics in order to be mobilized. So if they're too frightened, or if they're too content, some of those so-called working class people whose Mercedes was in the shop and they had to bring the Land Rover to the tent, they don't have a sufficiently high class identity. They're missing the Y variable. Well, the idea about causal explanation, or the idea about social explanation, is that we can do process tracing. We can do discovery of causal mechanisms, and we can do through a case study of, let's say the mobilization around Gdansk. Through, in fact, there's a really interesting study that was done in 1982 by a leading French sociologist. He took a team of younger, well, he was pretty young at that time. I met him when he was like 85. He was really ancient at that time, a year ago in Milan. But 40 years earlier, he was, mid-career guy. Anyway, he took a team of people and he interviewed a whole bunch of people, leaders, followers, and tried to do a case study of the solidarity movement while it was happening. That would be, kind of a causal inquiry, trying to identify what the causal mechanisms were, which led to success of mobilization in this case, as compared to failure in other cases. Quick show of hands, would you expect success or failure in a bad situation where people are being harmed by some circumstance, and if only a lot of people protested, maybe something could be better? Successful mobilization or unsuccessful? What do you think? Who thinks successful mobilization? Urgent, bad situation does that lead automatically to mobilization? No, it doesn't. In fact, I think Tilly would probably agree. Most circumstances of people suffering, whether it's economic hardship or a bad landlord, or the kind of circumstances with the Communist Party in Eastern Europe, the more common response is to kind of hunker down and find an individual level strategy of survival. Lucas, great.
Yeah, I'm trying that one of the readings we did today for the dissecting the social, there's this model. I'm forgetting what exactly it was, but one of the things was opportunity.
Mhm.
Do you know what I'm speaking of?
Yeah, desire, belief, opportunity.
That's what it was, right? Yeah. So I was just thinking like lower sort of if you have really harsh economic circumstances or just suffering in general or poverty, you really take away a lot of opportunity to mobilize, I would think, right? Because you just don't have the resources necessary to gather or to even really worry about anything except for maybe like immediate needs for physical health or something.
Okay, so I think that's a really interesting point in terms of what are the circumstances which make mobilization most likely? And you're kind of saying abject, cruel, harsh circumstances are maybe not the best, not the most likely circumstances of resistance. That you need to have at least enough access to food that you can go to the strike and eat for the day. So you need to have some access to resources. Okay, so that's a valid point. But maybe more generally, what's missing in DBO theory, where would normative traditions of resistance, the Catholic Church, the idea of Polish nationalism, and the idea of the Communist International, I don't know what the values are, which maybe these Polish workers had. Where would that come into DBO theory? I don't think it would come in at all. DBO theory, we're going to talk, I mean, we need to talk about it more. I'm glad, Lucas, that you kind of brought us to that point. But DBO theory and rational choice theory are studiously silent on the topic of cultural context, value context, normative context. They don't pay attention. Chandler, you may have a theory about how an economist might want to incorporate religious commitments or normative commitments. They do have a way. It's kind of a cheating and not very attractive way, but go ahead, give it a try.
I guess you could have some model of belief adoption that's sort of done before the economy starts. So agents sort of have a collection of behaviors and beliefs that give them utility.
I hadn't thought of that possibility. The other is that you might incorporate it into your theory of desire, that part of what I desire as an outcome is something that's consistent with my Catholic identity.
Oh, sure.
It just gets folded into my desires. But either way, that seems like a reduction of culture to just another preference in a way that maybe doesn't give enough weight to, well, what an institutionalist like Kathleen Thalen. I think you're going to love reading Kathleen Thalen. Her work is just really brilliant. But there's so much really interesting conversation that can happen around these various topics. Emily, go ahead.
I was just going to say that a lot of what you're saying is making me think about Sandel's critique of the liberalists and their kind of reduction of the self to something that's very, very impoverished. And how if you have a theory of the individual with a hugely impoverished concept of the self, you can't really, you're not really theorizing about individuals at all. And so your attempt to turn a kind of, well, in that case, in his work is a political theory into from an individualist setting somehow is absurdly anti-individualist. It doesn't really constitute what it means to be human in any meaningful way. I don't know if that parallel means anything to anyone else, but that's certainly what I keep thinking about.
It does sort of, and it's relevant to a distinction that's drawn in some of the readings we did between a thin theory of the actor and a thick theory of the actor. And Sandel would be interested in a thick theory of the actor. And that's really kind of what I'm advocating as well, that actors are situated in historical, cultural, normative, ideational settings, which really do influence their behavior in ways which are bigger than desire belief theory would suggest, or I have a rational ordering of my preferences, and here's what I do, I maximize my preference ordering. That would be rational choice theory. A thicker theory doesn't mean it's not an intentional, purposive actor, but it means that the actor is influenced by things that we would refer to as culture and religion and normative values and commitments. So all of that's pretty interesting. So let's, this is just a little teensy, I was trying to explain the poem, E.E. Cummings' poem, Life is not a paragraph, death, I think, is not a parenthesis, to my 6-year-old grandson. And my wife said, you know, he's not going to get that. Anyway, I'm putting in a little parenthesis here because I'd like to take the next 15 minutes or so. We're going to take a break in about 15 minutes. But I'd like to now talk about rational choice theory, intentionality, and desire belief opportunity theory. If you thought actor-centered approach to the social world is the right way to proceed, then you also kind of think that actors doing things intentionally, that's really kind of that's the stuff, that's the electrons, Margot, you know, in your chemistry and physics analogy. Individuals do things somehow deliberately, consciously, purposefully, and goal-directedly. So that might be premise one. Human beings are not robots. Rather, they are intentional agents who deliberate and choose and think and then do stuff. And then the next stop is, how should we think about the way that people decide to do things? Well, rational choice theory is the simplest possible articulation or specification of how people decide to act, how actors decide to act. So economic rationality, simple kind of abstract economic rationality, pure economic rationality, basically asserts only individuals have preferences of outcomes, and then rational individuals maximize the achievement of preferences according to their preference ranking. And then there are these other kind of formal requirements, including especially transitivity. How would you like to be the decision maker who prefers A to B, and she also prefers B to C, and by the way, she prefers C to A? How is that from the point of view of being a decision maker? Is that a good situation to be in? You prefer roast duck to asparagus, and asparagus to ice cream, and ice cream to roast duck. You can't decide because it's a cyclical preference. So the requirement in rational choice theory is that our preferences need to be complete. So we need to be able to rank all possible choices, and they need to be transitive. So if A is preferred to B, B is preferred to C, then A is preferred to C. So that's kind of like the first gloss on economic rationality. There's then the idea, the 19th century idea of economic rationality in terms of utility maximization. And those of you who are in economics programs, I'm going to really articulate this in a way that you think is kind of superficial and not very accurate, but I'll do it as best I can. But the substantive theory of utility is that everyone has an ability to assign utilities, measurable utilities to outcomes. And then a rational individual chooses outcomes which give a maximum value of utility for the outcome which is chosen. Now, there's a little bit of a problem here, and that is the problem of risk and uncertainty. So if I'm, I don't know, competing for a job in Ann Arbor or Alabama, and there's a 60% chance that I'll get the Alabama job and a 40% chance I'll get the Ann Arbor job, I would then need to assign utilities to the two. Risk and uncertainty, we have to assign a probability of success and a utility of the outcome. And then I should choose that option which has the highest expected utility. So expected utility is the product of the probability of the outcome times the utility of the outcome. Yeah, Chandler, you're on mute.
I'm talking to myself. You can have risk preferences. So I resent the phrase simple, by the way. MWG and Mostel, Winston, and Green are not simple. I'll tell you, it's hard.
Well, the complication, which I'm sure that you all were, at least those of you who study economics were cringing at, is the kind of assumption that utility is a real thing, whereas preference rankings are, they're just rankings. So if I prefer fish to fowl and fowl to lamb and lamb to lizard, that doesn't tell me how much. There's no intensity of preference, but there's a tricky way around that problem, which I think you probably, several of you know, the lottery thing is. Okay, so let's say we're ranking fish, which you prefer most, and then chicken, which is your intermediate preference, and lizard, which is your least preferred preference. And now we would, and so all we know is that it's A is preferred to B is preferred to C. But I now offer you, you can either have B or you can have a lottery of A and C. By adjusting the lottery so that B is, you are indifferent between B and the lottery of A and C, I can assign weights to A, B, and C. And we have assumed by completeness of preference that not only can I choose among fowl, fish, and lizard, but I also can choose among lotteries. If I can do that little trick, then I can go from ordinal utilities, just ranking with no intensity preference, to cardinal utilities with utility. It's still not an absolute utility because it's between 0 and 1. So that's not like some psychological characteristic, but it does at least give me information about how much more I prefer chicken to lizard relative to whatever I liked better. Oh, fish to chicken. I really hate lizard. So chicken and fish are going to be kind of close together. And lizard is a very distant third. I'd have to have huge odds to get the chicken thing before I would give up. No, I'd have to have huge odds on the fish to lizard bet before I would go for the bet rather than the sure thing of the chicken. Yeah, I think I got that right. In other words, rational choice theory comes down to a fairly simple idea, and it is the idea of maximizing expected utility of outcomes with these various kind of mathematical complications. But here's another complication. I just mentioned that I'm choosing between options, and I have to assign utility to the option and probability to the option. I'm kind of implicitly assuming that I have good knowledge, good information about the options and their likelihood. But actually, information is itself costly. So the assumption that I have complete information about the options, that's a simplifying assumption. It makes it easier to calculate, but it is unrealistic. So economic rationality, maximizing rationality, it is a maximizing model of decision-making. This is very powerful, by the way. If we wanted to understand whether Jan Gross, our Polish worker, is going to join the revolution or not, he would now have to decide, what do I get individually from successful revolution times the probability of successful revolution, and what do I get from staying home? There is a complication here also, because it's a public good. Revolution is a public good. So let's say it's Jan isn't, forget about revolution, forget about resistance. Jan is considering going out to catch a Polish lion. And the lion is worth $1,000 if he can catch it, but there's a 40% likelihood of his being killed by the lion. So he's got a likelihood of being killed by the lion. It's a simple matter of choice. What does he get if he stays home? He stays poor, and that's 100% likelihood. If he goes after the lion, he becomes really rich Polish guy, 60% likelihood, or really dead Polish guy, 40% likelihood. Now he simply has to maximize. He simply has to decide which of these two options gives me the greater utility. And then he does the thing which gives him the greatest expected utility. Why should you go for greatest expected utility? What's the standard economist's answer to why you should choose the option with the greatest expected utility? Anybody want to just kind of quickly explain that? It's like going to Las Vegas. Why should you bet? Yeah, go ahead, Zhuang.
Yeah, I just have a question about the rational choices. So I listened to the example. I think this process you analyze which is a more benefit. This process is rational, but when you make the decision, it's not depend on the rational thinking. It's depend on your emotion. In some situation, we think this might give me more benefit, but personally, I prefer that one. So although you have the rational thinking, but finally you make the decision is not depend on your rational, or sometimes depend on your emotion things.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so that's my.
Okay, that's an interesting point, yeah.
So in this case, what is definition of the rational?
Well, I think there are two possibilities here. One is that your emotional attachment to option A versus option B. Let's say that option B, from a pure utility point of view, option B gives you a higher result. Let's say it's income. Two jobs, one has a $100,000 a year income, the other has a $60,000 a year income. So if you're just maximizing income, you should go for the B job. Unfortunately, the B job has you have to wear a stupid looking uniform, and you really can't bear the idea of wearing that stupid uniform. And therefore your emotions say, go for the other job. Well, you might say you're being irrational, or you might say that actually changed your utilities, that it's no longer just income, but it's income plus embarrassment. And when you add the embarrassment disutility into the calculation, then you've still made a rational choice. It's just that the pain of, if you just look at the income that you get from the two jobs, you're not measuring all of the sources of utility and disutility. So in that case, it's not irrational at all. But if, we could work out an example where it's just flatly irrational. I don't know if I can think of an example. I'm thinking of foods. The food, there may be two plates of food. One is super nutritious and tasty and so forth, and the other is only half as nutritious and half as tasty. So from the point of view of my culinary pleasure, I should go for the first plate. But actually, I just don't like the looks of it. No reason at all. I just don't like it. I just have that reaction. I'm trying to model your thought about an emotional reaction. And therefore I go for the second plate, which is not nutritious, not tasty, but I don't object to the looks. You might say, I don't know, one way of putting that would be to say that person is not reacting rationally. Though I think Chandler wants to understand it more as you have to take into account the discomfort you have in looking at the bad food. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, yeah,
Mhm.
that matters.
Yeah. So it is, it's a question of where you put the utility, but it was the reason why I said that economists sometimes handle this problem in a way which I think kind of trivializes the problem. If one has a moral objection to a certain kind of behavior, like, oh, I don't know, you're being offered a promotion at work, but the only thing is you have to arbitrarily fire 3 people for no reason, but you're going to get a big salary increase. I think many people would say, I'm not willing to accept that job, even though I get 40% more salary, because I have a moral objection. Personally, I'm not that comfortable with just kind of building that into the utility space. I want to see that as a side constraint on decision-making. In other words, I want to kind of agree with Jiwen that decision-making of real actors is actually broader than simply maximization of benefit. Quite a few years ago, I was in a reading group in Cambridge. I guess I was visiting at Harvard at that time. And we spent a lot of time on extended practical rationality. Extended practical rationality. In fact, I tried to find the document that I wrote at that time. I found kind of an outline of it. I didn't find the full document. But it's the idea that maximizing benefits is one portion of intelligent decision-making. But paying attention to moral constraints, political commitments, maybe even aesthetic preferences, that is a perfectly legitimate portion of extended practical rationality. That in other words, it's a misnomer to imagine that pure maximizing behavior, that is the essence of rational decision-making. And in fact, Amartya Sen, how many of you have ever read anything by Amartya Sen? So Amartya Sen is a Nobel Prize winning Indian economist at Harvard and also teaches in India. He's pretty old now. But he wrote an essay called Rational Fools, which is a critique of the idea of pure economic rationality. And Jiwen, it's analogous to the problem that you're raising. That's why I mentioned it. His view was that almost all social cooperation is impossible if individuals are merely maximizing benefits, utility-defined benefits. In fact, he says the purely rational individual is close to being a social moron. It's a very memorable line. The purely rational, economically rational individual is very close to being a social moron. Now, what does that mean? Why does he say that? Well, he says it for, like the reason why I was unwilling to accept the job that meant I had to arbitrarily fire 3 people, because I had, well, he introduces a term for it. I had commitments. So Sen argues that rational decision-making is actually a more complex process. Maximizing is a part of it, but so is honoring one's commitments. And sometimes those come into tension. And it's not at all irrational to favor the commitments over the maximum benefits. It's a powerful essay. I probably should have assigned the essay, but it's easy to find. I think you would enjoy reading it because it really kind of broadens our understanding of why pure economic rationality is it's useful, it's valuable for certain purposes. It explains microeconomic behavior very well. It explains market behavior, maybe even corporate decision-making behavior very well. But there are other things it doesn't explain very well. And Zhiwen, you were mentioning a couple of items. The person who is really religious and who is being told, you can have this job, but you have to work on the Sabbath. Well, I have a major objection to working on the Sabbath, so I can't do that. Boris Fischer, is it Boris Fischer? No, it's the great chess player who beat Spassky, I forget. It was the chess championship of 1980.
Bobby Fischer.
Bobby Fischer, there you go. Bobby Fischer would not play on his Christian Sabbath. And it completely messed up the whole schedule of running the chess championship. So that was really a big mess. But he was quite adamant. His religious commitment made it impossible for him to do what was otherwise, from a business rationality point of view, the right thing to do. Well, that would be an example of a conflict of commitment. Now, economists have tried to understand this in terms of, well, we just fold that into our preference ranking. I am personally kind of concerned that that sort of deflates the idea of preference ranking, because now it's not just comparing jobs by their income, but it's jobs plus, my taste or distaste for what I'm asked to do. It's 7:30. I vowed to myself I would give you a break at 7:30. So why don't we take a 10-minute break? We'll then turn to, I think both Lucas and Chandler have presentations to make. And if we have even a minute to talk about DBO theory, I'd like to do that. But more important is the presentations. So at 7:40, we'll come back, okay? Great. Okay, welcome back. Thanks for being prompt. So let's go to the presentations. And I wonder, let's see, there's the Ostrom critique of the several books. Chandler, you're doing that. Lucas, you're doing some parts of the Coleman book or chapter. I hope you got my message that you shouldn't feel obliged to treat every part of it. Why don't we start actually with Coleman, if you don't mind, because Chandler, I think the comments are actually, they kind of fit more readily once we've seen how rational choice is sometimes used by sociologists. So let's start with you, Lucas. And
yeah, great. I'll
oh, you need the
try sharing my screen.
Yeah, I'll give you the co-host status. There you go. Good.
Another word that has entered our vocabulary. Yeah.
Did I get the wrong person?
I still cannot. Yeah.
Looks like I see what happened. Yeah, the mouse just kept moving around. There we go. Good. Now you're set.
Okay, hopefully you guys can see that.
Yep.
Great. Okay. So I don't, yeah. I don't have, this is not the longest presentation. It's probably like 6 or 7 slides. I'll try to make it not too long. We'll see. So yeah, this is just on the chapter 10 from the demand for effective norms. I'm from James S. Coleman's Foundation of Social Theory that we just read. I'm mostly going to be looking at sort of the most important parts of like what are norms and sort of, in his opinion, how and why they arise. So I don't know if you guys can see everything, right?
Yeah, we can see everything.
Okay, I didn't know if it was blocking my screen. It's a little different on my screen, but okay. So that's good. So what are norms? In the first part of the chapter, he introduces a few different ideas that have been, I guess, bounced around. So he says that a norm can be a property of a macro and a micro social system, but not an actor within them. A norm can explain individual behavior. They can provide a basis for a principle of action. They're important in describing how societies function. They may be taken as axiomatic, or the concept can just be altogether disregarded. So there's, yeah, I guess different opinions there about how that works. But in his opinion, he has a very strict definition of how he defines norms. So he says a norm is, they specify what actions are regarded by a set of persons as proper or correct, or improper or correct. They are purposively generated in that those persons who initiate or help maintain a norm see themselves as benefiting from it being observed or harmed by its being violated. Norms are ordinarily enforced by sanctions, which are either rewards for carrying out those actions regarded as correct, or punishments for carrying out those actions regarded as incorrect. So we see sort of the core components of his definition are being purposely generated actions, either by individual actors or by sort of a system that gets somehow, it sort of, I guess, becomes integrated into the system. And then they're enforced by sanctions, so either rewards or punishments that seek to try and encourage a behavior, or what we'll call it a focal action, which is the terminology that he uses. So they either seek to encourage a focal action or discourage a focal action. And then they, our course, are trying to influence our decisions and which actions we take. And then he writes here, a norm concerning a specific action exists when the socially defined right to control the action is held not by the actor, but by others. So there's this sort of paradigm, I guess, that the norm is a social construct that then is being, that is influencing an individual actor's decisions. And Dan, if I say something wrong, please correct me. This is my nascent understanding.
No, all good so far, thanks.
So why do norms come to exist? That's, you know, a difficult question, and we'll see at the end of the PowerPoint, somewhere in the middle of the chapter that we read, he actually has a lot of questions, and I guess there's still a lot of questions surrounding how we actually get norms. But what he says here is that norms exist only when others assume the right to affect the direction of an actor's action. So if an individual actor has the right to their own action, then norms are not going to exist. And he sort of builds his theory, I assume, throughout the rest of the book, but is briefly mentioned in this chapter, that his social theories have these three sort of core components: macro to micro transition, micro to macro transition, and a purposive action taken at the micro level. And then he writes here, sort of building up this definition of a norm, then norms are macro level constructs based on purposive actions at the micro level, but coming into existence under certain conditions through a micro to micro transition. One in existence, once in existence, lead to actions of individuals, sanctions or threat of actions which affect the utilities and thus the actions of the individuals to whom the sanctions have been or might be applied. So we have sort of a macro level social construct that is influencing behaviors at a micro level based on either based on a feedback process, or these sanctions that are either going to be positive or negative. Yeah. So then in classifying norms, he has a bunch of different examples. I didn't provide them here. I'm sure we'll discuss some later. But he generally builds up in classifying norms. He has a system for proscriptive versus prescriptive norms. A proscriptive norm acts to discourage a focal action or a target action of a norm, and provides negative feedback in the social system. So it tries to prescribe a specific focal action or discourage it. A prescriptive norm is going to be one that encourages a focal action and then provides positive feedback. I should say provide, not prove. Man, lots of typos.
May I ask a quick question?
Yeah, please.
I use the raise hand feature, but I don't think you can see that.
I definitely did not. No.
That's perfectly fine. Yeah. So is he like, just in a general way, is this by definition, is he defining these things, or is he recording what he has empirically observed in terms of these things called norms?
you know, the I wasn't sure about that either. I don't know if Dan has a better answer to that. I wasn't sure if these are simply his empirical observations or more a system that he's trying to provide for us.
So I would say it's a substantive definition. He thinks it's a definition that needs to be justified. So in that sense, it's not just, you know, kind of an a priori definition, but also it's not an empirical discovery. There are certain things he's ruling out, not norms. So if I have a self-imposed religious belief I shouldn't work on the Sabbath, that's not a norm because it's not externally, well, other people might say it is a norm, it's just a self-imposed norm, but his definition rules that out. So I would call it a substantive sociological definition.
Okay, great. If that answers your question, then I will continue. He mentions that this distinction between prescriptive and prescriptive is only important when the number of meaningful alternative actions is greater than 2. He gives this example of if you have this norm of sort of shuffling to the right side when passing someone on the sidewalk, if you only really have one, if there's only really 2 outcomes, then it's, you know, this norm is going to be both prescriptive and prescriptive. So it's not going to be a meaningful classification, if I understood that correctly. And then understanding the sort of, you know, looking at our terminology in terms of who is acting on sort of how norms are acting on people. He describes beneficiaries and targets, where beneficiaries of norms are those who benefit from the norm, and then to some extent assume the right to partially control the action, either at a micro level in sort of a closed, like micro situation, or even to some extent a macro level of control. But that was something that I, you know, I wasn't entirely sure how we get from a sort of micro level control to having control over a macro level system of social norms. That would be one of my questions, and I have a few questions at the end of the PowerPoint as well. And then a target of a norm would be actors whose actions or potential actions are the focal actions of the norm. So what actual actions do we want to prescribe or prescribe? And then he gives this, there's a sort of wide range here. He says these are 2 extremes. He calls these conjoint, like we can have either conjoint norms or disjoint norms based on who the beneficiary and targets of a norm are. And he says these are 2 extremes. And as you can see at the bottom of the PowerPoint here, he sort of lists there several different complex situations where you can have a norm who's benefiting the same, if I understood correctly, benefiting the same person or action taken by the beneficiary or something like that. Whereas a disjoint norm has 2 distinct groups from beneficiaries and targets, and then I guess everything in between. Yeah, so then this would be sort of my shorthand, you know, looking through of and understanding this text. But he lists a bunch of questions in the middle about how do we actually get to some of these more complex actions of norms, I guess. And so I wrote them down here. You know, why do norms not always arise when the existence of an effective norm would be in the interests of all or most people? One thing that, you know, I thought was really fascinating is how and why are norms internalized, and under what conditions may norms be internalized versus externally enforced. So these are sort of my my leftover questions plus the questions that Coleman had brought up in the text, and that's pretty much everything I got for the PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm. Good. Chandler, you were going to raise a question.
Yeah. So how much do you think, just from your understanding of the reading, there's almost like a question of demarcation or something. How much of this is psychology and how much of this is sociology? And this is a problem for anybody who studies human behavior.
I don't feel qualified to answer that.
Based upon your, I don't know.
Is
Well,
that like a question for just like discussion, or is that a question for Lucas?
right.
Question for the world.
Did you have a thought about it, Margot?
No, but I would try to formulate one if it was an open discussion question.
By all
But just
means.
as a start of an answer, it's clearly not just psychological, because he's specifically looking at the relationship between the norm creator and enforcer versus the individual whose actions are affected. And he's asking the question, who has the interest to either create the norm or to enforce the norm? Masking, if you go into a supermarket and the norm or the rule is wear a mask, I think most of us don't intervene when we see someone not masking for a couple of kind of obvious reasons. We don't want to be, conceived to be intrusive, but also there's the crazy fact that in Michigan, probably 50% of people are armed, and crazy people with guns often don't wear masks. So we have a scary disincentive from enforcing. In other words, enforcing creates costs. And he's asking the really hard question, why would anyone ever enforce a norm? Why would anyone ever take on the risk or the cost of enforcing a norm which he doesn't directly benefit from? That's kind of the sociological question which he's posing. That's my answer to your question anyway.
Well, that's why I'm confused, because I feel like that's deeply psychological. Like why do I wear clothes in the morning? I suppose there's a sociological explanation for the appearance of the reason why clothing exists, all this stuff. But then why do I, bother wearing clothes? That seems psychological to me. But
why do you have that that internalized taste? You have it because you've been exposed to other people who've taken the trouble to exert the norm and assert the norm, exert and assert. That's not necessarily an adequate explanation, I don't think, but I think it is his question. His question is a rational choice question. Lucas, you started with this point that norms are created by, it's a very strong thing for him to state. Norms are created by individuals who have an interest in that particular norm. So that's a very direct, rational choice explanation. Yeah, go ahead, Lucas.
Yeah, if I can go back to a slide here. Yeah, his sort of, I was thinking about this, his three components here, necessary for social theory. It seems like somehow we get from a social behavior that starts at the micro level, and somehow there's a beneficiary, or at least some party that's interested in controlling a behavior, and I guess there somehow we get from a micro level social situation to like a big picture macro social situation, social norm, like wearing clothes, for example. So I don't know how much of that is a psychological thing so much as it's somehow a very internalized, I would say, like cultural norm. And so I would say, one part, maybe just a conjecture on my part or something, but different cultures likely are constructed out of different macro norms. And so, yeah. But I guess I don't know how that happens.
He wouldn't want to say that the culture itself is an actor. So the culture is somehow embodied. Can you give up the screen share for just a minute? And I'm going to share a very famous diagram of his, which is called Coleman's boat. For obvious reasons, but for some reason, this is really odd. I'm not being permitted to share my screen. Funny.
Perhaps now I'm the host and have to give it back to you, but
Yeah, I've never tried after someone else is host.
oh, it does say you're host.
So let's see if this is the right one. I'm sorry to, this is an important diagram and it's exactly relevant to the point that Lucas was just making. So I have to allow something.
I was going to show a picture which I've got written in my notes, but I realized that it comes out as a mirror, I think, on the screen.
Oh, you have it. Yeah, that's the exact diagram I wanted to show. So if people can see that.
Is that not in mirror writing?
It is, but it's the diagram. So what you can see there, in fact, I'm going to make for me, you're going to be the speaker. Go ahead and hold it up there again.
Okay.
If other people put Emily into the speaker, then you can really see this diagram very well. And this is referred to as Coleman's boat, or sometimes Coleman's bathtub. Kind of funny. And what it represents is the macro is upper left. Macro, actually, Emily, it reads correctly. It's not.
Oh, does it? Oh, that's good.
Left, right. But so macro influences actors at the micro level. Actors then do various things. That's the to link. Actors then aggregate to a macro circumstance again. In other words, he's saying there's no such thing as macro to macro causal relationship. Rather, there's macro influence micro, i.e. individuals. The individuals do various things. Their behavior then re-aggregates. We can call this an aggregative explanation. Their actions and interactions then re-aggregate to another macro level circumstance. So in terms of Lucas's presentation, there is the fact, let's say the fact exists that people have to wear clothes. That's a norm. Somebody established that norm, and we can ask the historical question, why did anyone establish that norm? Well, Coleman has a constraint. The constraint is whoever established it had an interest in having that norm established. But then the hard question is what makes the norm persist in the social institutional environment in which it exists? Given that it exists, it influences individual behavior. That's what happens, as you come down the link of the Coleman boat. Then individuals who are acting according to that norm, and by the way, other norms as well, they interact in various ways, and then possibly they re-aggregate. The example that he gives when he first introduces the Coleman's boat is Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. He's illustrating Max Weber's famous argument that the Protestant ethic causes the emergence of capitalist behavior. And he's basically saying it doesn't do that directly. Instead, it influences individual behavior. Individuals then interact within the terms of their internalized Protestant ethic, which then gives rise to capitalist behavior, which re-aggregates to a capitalist system. That's exactly, Lucas, what you were referring to as the macro to micro to macro. That's why I interrupted your presentation a little bit to try to show you. And Emily, thank you for having it right at hand there. Okay, so the really important point, Lucas, you said you were a little confused at the beneficiary and the target or whatever those. I found that a completely irritating diagram. It didn't seem to have any point. And for that reason, I didn't kind of dwell on it. But whereas the Coleman boat diagram, I think, has a very important point, though a contested point. And I have my own drawing, which is not Coleman's boat. It's instead the idea that there is direct, I call it meso to meso as opposed to macro to macro, because I also think we really need to be thinking about kind of intermediate level social structures like organizations and corporations and so forth, not the grossest, highest level macro entities, but things kind of in between, police departments and universities and corporations. But I want to leave it that, it's too bad I can't share I'll figure out why I can't share my screen, but I want to leave it that the organization of a police department can cause the killing of unarmed Black men. So in other words, a meso to meso outcome is being directly caused, even though it has micro foundations. It has micro foundations at the individual cop level, but it's the organization of the police department and the police culture which is causing the killing of unarmed Black men. So in other words, I assert, contrary to Coleman, that meso to meso causal relationship is possible. He's saying it's conceptually impossible. Conceptually, we can only imagine macro causes micro stuff, which causes more micro stuff, which then causes macro stuff. You have to go down, trace the struts of the boat. I want to put it forward that that's not a compelling view for any of the special sciences. For psychology, for example. In psychology, we do, kind of intermediate level causation all the time, even though we understand that computational states of the brain are embodied in neurophysiological states, but we don't have to trace out the connection from the computational state to the neurophysiological state back to another computational state. Margot, you had a point, and then Chandler.
Yeah, so I like this idea that there's meso-level direct causality, that we don't need to go through the individual. But I guess that's kind of what I was trying to get at with the, earlier in the seminar. And I'm wondering if you see any tension between the meso to meso causality and the actor-centered theory. Because now I'm thinking if there's not a tension, I'm misunderstanding the actor-centered approach.
Right. So that's such a great question. In fact, in my blog, I posed that very question to myself a number of years ago, that I'm defending meso-meso causation, and I'm defending the idea of micro foundations. Are they compatible? And in the end, I conclude that they are compatible for this reason about the special sciences more generally, that we don't require reduction in genetics or in neuropsychology or in computational models of memory. We don't require, just on kind of scientific methodological grounds, the only legitimate explanation of memory goes from an information processing analysis of memory to a neurophysiological embodiment back to, another fact about memory. We don't require that. The article that I refer to, I think it's really an important article, is from the 60s and 70s. Jerry Fodor, the philosopher, wrote a book, not a book, but an article called The Special Sciences, which is an anti-reductionist tract. And his view is not that there aren't foundations, it's rather that scientific explanation doesn't require we trace out the foundations. And that's exactly the view I want to take about meso-level causation. When I say there are certain features of police department organization which make the murder of unarmed Black men much more likely, we can identify those organizational features. We can also say how they're embodied and how they came about. That is to give the micro foundations. But we don't need to trace through those micro foundations in order to account for Minneapolis. Instead, we can really just identify the Minneapolis Police Department had these characteristics, and the occasional, but more frequent than chance would allow, killing of an unarmed Black man will be the result. That would be a causal argument about meso-level organizational characteristics. The kind of example that I've worked with a lot more has to do with technology accidents, that there are features of the organization of a nuclear power plant, let's say, or of a hospital, which are conducive to accidents. We can identify those features. We can also, of course, say what the micro foundations of those features are, but that's not what's interesting. The interesting part is there's lack of adequate training and supervision. That's the organizational feature which leads to the accidents. And by identifying that feature, we've also got a good causal mechanism. That's the argument that I like to make. Yes. Okay, Chandler, you were going to make a point too.
I'm not making this point, but I could imagine someone making the point that idealism or someone could make some sort of critique that, ideas don't really cause things. It kind of feels like we're getting close. I'm not saying that, but it feels like we're kind of approaching that. How do we get around that?
So the idea that ideas are epiphenomenal, that this is actually very close to the philosophical theory of supervenience, which is probably familiar to Margot, maybe one or two others. It was actually a theory developed by a faculty member, Kim, Yagwan Kim, but he was specifically interested in mental entity.
And Brown, I just have to say, he was also at Brown.
That's right, he went from Michigan to Brown, exactly. But I had forgotten that part of it. But he was specifically interested in what is the relationship between mental entities and physical entities, between thoughts and brains. And his view is that mental entities are supervenient upon physical states of the brain. And what he means by that, his definition is very simple. I'll just say it because it's very memorable. No differences at the supervenient level without at least some difference at the underlying level. So you can't have two different mental states corresponding to exactly the same brain state. It's a very weak condition, but anyway, that's what supervenience involves. But it also implies that there's no such thing as causation from the supervenient entity to another supervenient entity. It must go down, through the neurophysiology. I guess the short answer is that along with people who make arguments in genetic theory and neurophysiology and computational systems, I think we all kind of agree that there are characteristics at the higher level, which of course have to be embodied in some kind of physical system. That's the truth of physicalism. But the causal connection doesn't, it's just a kind of an old-fashioned conception of causation to imagine that it must be, one thing bumping another thing. Rather, a causal connection can be that circumstance which leads through an identifiable causal mechanism to a certain other kind of outcome. So if people in the Polish village have a shared belief, many of them have the shared belief, the Catholic theology that we share says it's good to sacrifice for, your brother and sister worker. That's a shared belief we have. That's an ideational thing. Personally, I don't have any hesitation to say that's a cause of successful mobilization. In some ways, you might say, there's an article of mine I think I'm going to ask you to read. I think it's in the syllabus, but it's on weaknesses of analytical sociology. But it was in a journal called, I think it was in Sociologica. And the thing about Sociologica is they then invite comments by other experts. And so I made the claim, analytical sociology requires that causation proceeds from macro to micro, back to macro. I disputed that in my article. And half of the analytical sociologists said, you're an idiot, because of course it must be disaggregated. And the other half said, it's obviously true what you're saying. It's perfectly fine to have causation from here to there. So I think even the analytical sociologists are kind of willing to be in a state of disagreement. But the reason why I want to refer to Jerry Fodor is that I think we're all comfortable with biological explanations, neurophysiological explanations, even computational theories of mental states, like pattern recognition and memory and so forth. We're comfortable with descriptions at that level and comfortable with the idea that they are systematic, that they, one computational state of a system causes another computational state of a system, even though we know, of course, the computational state is embodied in circuits or neurons or whatever. It's embodied in something. So in some sense, it's true that the causal workings pass through the physical processes. But again, that's not what's interesting about neurophysiology or biology or genetic theory or sociology. It's kind of the line of thought. Anything else for Lucas before we move on? You did a nice job, Lucas, and you also showed a certain amount of courage being the very first presenter. So that's a mental state, courage is. So, okay, let's move on to Chandler. And you're doing also an interesting paper by, in fact, if you didn't mind, I didn't ask you to do this, but since you and I talked about it a little earlier, you might say a little bit about who Elinor Ostrom is and what her claim to fame is before you turn to, if you don't mind. I know that you know about it.
Sure. I'm not too specialized in Elinor Ostrom, but she is the first female economist to earn a Nobel Prize in economics, and she worked at Indiana University for a very long time. Her most prestigious work probably is sort of her description analysis of something called the tragedy of the commons, which is effectively how communities, mess with shared resources effectively. So you can think about, like, we all have a common pool of fish and we all like fishing, but because we're only taking into account our own personal valuation of things, we will overfish and then everyone gets harmed from it. She did a lot of really cool work. And she easily on any top 10 economist of the 20th century list. She's very, very good. So I titled this little thing Thoughts.
Can I just add one thing to that, Chandler?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
So relevant to the topic we've been discussing.
Yes.
A pure rational choice analysis of the commons implies the tragedy of the commons, that people will not contribute to the public good and the commons will be immediately degraded.
Yeah.
And her empirical historical work and the center at Indiana University has demonstrated that
that's not necessarily true.
It's just not true, that forest lands and grasslands and fishing terrains, that communities, human communities in different settings all over the globe and through long stretches of history were able to make social arrangements which managed the commons in a stable way. That was a really important discovery. And it's very relevant to our topic today, though. So that's why I suggested that you might say a word.
That is absolutely true. Yes. I will add, though, you can make a famous quote from Ostrom. And in fact, at the end of my presentation, oh no, can I not move? Oh, here we go. Is a resource arrangement that works in practice can work in theory. So you can justify these things. It's not just a repudiation of rational choice theory, it's a repudiation of naive rational choice theory. But I called this Thoughts Inspired because I didn't go into the details in terms of the names and things of the people she quotes. I do that a little bit, but it's more about some of the thoughts I had and the concepts that Ostrom deals with in this article. So very quickly, I have a brief aside by what I mean by rational. The term rational has a rich history, as we know from reading some various things, including our little reading list. But by rational, I mean that a preference relation, given a set of alternatives, satisfies, as we mentioned in lecture before, transitivity and completeness. Those are two fairly weak properties, even though we can easily imagine many preference relations that are not transitive. You might, for example, a good example is like, if you think about like a football game, and you have 3 football teams. Team A might beat Team B, and Team B might beat Team C, but that does not imply Team A will beat Team C for a variety of reasons. Some technical notes I would like to add: rational preferences need not map to utility maximization, and this is a very sad thing from an economist point of view. Not all rational preferences or not all preference orderings that are rational can satisfy this. The classic example is lexicographic preferences, which is the idea of, I want one thing more than everything else. So you'll just maximize one object. And then once you get that amount of stuff, you're willing to start picking other things. But that's an aside. And finally, utility representations need not map to rational preferences. There are many utility representations you can think of that are not necessarily rational. Okay. Some more quick things, just because this is my field, so I feel a need to mention it. Aggregated rational agents do not have to behave rationally, which is a very sad thing. You can have a set of perfectly economically rational agents making decisions, and the aggregate economy need not behave rationally, which made us all very depressed in the 1970s. A professor of mine, Tillman, mentioned this, and he said everyone was very sad. Also, but similarly, aggregations with irrational agents can still behave rationally. So you can have a little bit of irrationality in your system so long as it's not too extreme, and you can get some good stuff. Finally, I have a brief description of what equilibrium is. As general as I can be, it still might not be very good, but given a set of exogenous processes in an environment and sequence of endogenous states, I can write down a set of actions or planned actions for every agent in my system from which no agent would deviate if given a choice or the agent is constrained. Okay, so this is sort of, this is what I mean by equilibrium, and this is how we make predictions. Not sure how useful that is, but this is sort of, that's what equilibrium means when I talk about it. Okay, so back to the paper. So there are two sort of underlying questions that this paper sort of surveys, which is how do agents make decisions and how do agents justify their decisions? This point is less explicit, but I think it is important. And there are these two sorts of logics, this rough set of potential logics you can think about. So the first set is known as, is dubbed the logic of appropriateness, which is this idea that agents make decisions based upon rules embedded in different situations. So for example, I might explain my behavior by, the reason why I say bless you when you sneeze, right? There's no rational choice framework that really, maybe you can come up with one, but really it's just kind of a rule of politeness. I say bless you when you sneeze because, that's just the sort of rule that has governed my society. Rules could also be structured as societal values. I might value something from a, social point of view that doesn't map to my, self-interest. Actual laws might compel me to do a certain thing, and social structures. By the way, I don't mean this to just me be, talking at you the whole time. So if you ever want to jump in, nothing I say is that powerful or endearing. So if you have something you want to say, please jump in and interrupt me. The second sort of logic that can explain decisions is something called a logic of consequentiality. I think I said that right. So which is agents tend to make decisions not based upon rules, but based on calculated outcomes of their actions given their objectives. So, firms work to maximize profits, and that's why they do what they do. Agents, have a certain utility level, so they make a decision on what job to take based on that. And this is what is dubbed sort of this logic of consequentiality. And there's this sort of, there's this either or, I guess, in the literature that Olson, Ostrom wants to reject, which I think is important. So limits of rational choice theory in a normative analysis. So Ostrom describes rational choice theory in as a way of giving advice. This is one way you can view rational choice theory. And I write down an example, game theory, rock, paper, scissors. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, suppose you wanted to give advice based upon rational choice theory about what an agent should do when you're playing a game of rock, paper, scissors. Okay, if all you care about is winning the game, and you presume the other agent only cares about winning the game, game theory tells you precisely what your strategy ought to be. You should completely randomize, totally randomize. However, as Ostrom points out, this normative advice depends on the positive predictions and specifications of the model. That advice you should completely randomize is wrong if, for whatever reason, you think the other agent is not basing their decision upon game theory. You know, you might think that maybe an agent just loves picking scissors, right? If that were the case, then game theory would not give you a very good advice on how to perform the game. Or maybe you want to lose the game. Those sorts of things. Now, an important point that I kind of wanted to mention earlier, but forgot to, but I wrote it down here just in case I forgot to do it. I think it's March and Olson. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right. March and Olson. Mm-hmm. They bring up this point. They're basically they advocate a logic of appropriateness to explain behavior, but then say the logic of consequentiality is often used to justify behavior ex post. So they believe in Western culture, we generally justify our behavior after the fact, that I was just doing things in my best interest. But in reality, my behavior was in fact governed by a set of norms and societal ideals, with this logic of appropriateness. Ostrom, I think, rightly points out that this is not always the case. It's not merely the case that we justify our behavior as consequence-driven. We do sometimes choose and make decisions based upon the consequences of our actions. The best example of that is, profit-maximizing firms, for example. Firms really do fairly robustly act to maximize profits. When you're taking an exam, how you want to allocate your time, you try to maximize the way you answer questions. But this is a question. How do agents justify their own behavior ex post? Ostrom also points out, well, she refers to another writer. I believe her name is his name is Elster. Elster, is that?
Yeah.
Elster. She brings up an example mentioned by Elster, who says that basically certain institutions make consequence logic more justified. And she brings this up in the context of legal systems and the concept of society's concept of legality. So for example, if you have a system of legality where you believe agents have to be prescribed actions, and any actions outside of that prescription are illegal, and the states can intervene whenever it wants to, a logic of appropriateness might be more fruitful. In contrast, if you see state laws as merely prohibiting certain actions, but then anything else agents can do, and the government is only able to intervene in certain moments, then perhaps a logic of consequences makes more sense. Okay, so what Ostrom wants to do is sort of merge these two ideas. And this is her idea. You can merge the logic of appropriateness with the logic of consequentiality by endogenizing the rules of the game. So what do I mean by that? Well, you can think about a game in terms of levels. And she brings up the example of an extensive form game. And this is how I think she's thinking of it, okay? And I bring up this example, a model for how cars drive, okay? Suppose you wanted to create a model that explained why cars drive the way they do, okay? Clearly, this system requires a mixture of the logic of appropriateness and the logic of consequentiality, right? How can we merge these two sorts of ideas together? Well, you could think about a multi-level system. The first level is before any cars begin driving, you have politicians sort of, make up the rules of driving, the rules of the road based upon some objective, and then create these rules. Down the level, cars drive in a certain way such that they conform to those rules developed by the higher ups, who may have based their rules on, the logic of consequentiality. Maybe they close a bridge based upon their political rivals, to bring up a non-specific example, to punish their political rivals or something like that. But this multi-level approach, I think, could be very fruitful, and that's sort of what Osham seems to be advocating. So here's some limits of rational choice theory as a positive enterprise. This is the next section of the paper. So a big problem with rational choice theory is oftentimes there is this issue of indeterminacy. So what do I mean by that? You can set up these mathematical models and these systems of agents making rational choice, but oftentimes these systems lead to multiple equilibria. What does that mean? It means there are sets of actions whereby no agent would choose to deviate once you prescribe those actions. But if there are multiple sets of actions, you don't really know which one the agents are going to choose. It might be one or the other, but you can't make any precise predictions. And this comes up all the time. There also might be a lack of equilibria, which is less common, but it does happen, which means there are no sets of actions whereby agents they would always choose to deviate for whatever reason, or there exists at least one agent whereby someone would deviate. I do wonder whether or not this is a bad thing. Just because a model can't make a prediction, does that mean that the model is necessarily bad? I don't know. It might just be that there is no prediction. And I write down there's a budding robust literature in economics on equilibrium refinement, which is determining different concepts of equilibrium in order to get to more precise answers of questions. Another big criticism is applicability that Ostrom, of course, mentions through her criticism and analysis of various authors. The assumptions needed for exact model to be true are often incorrect. This is something that is well known to economists and to, I imagine, rational choice theorists. Is this always a problem? Well, it depends on what you're using your model for. A very famous quote, no model is true, some models are useful. But oftentimes, for example, informational assumptions fail. Assumptions about agents' preferences is often, simplistic. Various assumptions tend to be false. But as I mentioned over here, and Ostrom, of course, brings this up and mentions it, but she shows and mentions various examples where rational choice theory is in fact quite robust and allows you to come up with multiple different systems that actually conform pretty interestingly well to the real world. And I bring up some more modern examples. Behavioral economics, there's something called rational inattention, which is really interesting, which is this idea that agents, it operates under the assumption that agents only have limited computing power. So for example, it might be perfectly rational for you to not know all of the objects that are for sale in a grocery store. Why? Because you have a limited amount of attention to allocate. So there are various concepts, whatnot, within the frame of rational choice that can be accommodated. All right. Yes. She brings up this concept of hyperrationality, which again was proposed by March and Olson, I believe. Yes. Which is this idea that basically it's this accusation that one may levy at a rational choice theory. And I summarize it here. So, if you assume perfect information where the assumption is not necessarily correct, if you reframe the problem to get an answer, ignoring issues that would lead to indeterminacy purely for the sake of getting an answer, or if you attempt to assess the best action in a situation rather than looking for general rules that covers many cases, you might be susceptible to this criticism of hyper-rationality. I bring up an example that is very fun in economics, which is attempting to model gift giving. This is a real problem in economics because it's intuitively somewhat easy for an economist to think of a reason why an agent might give a gift, right? Suppose you get some utility from giving a gift to an agent, right? Well, when you give this altruism to agents and models, there's a tendency for the agents to sort of give the gift back and forth to get as much utility as possible into infinity. It's very difficult to come up with ways to model gift giving under a rational choice framework, because you have to come up with really ad hoc reasons for why does a, given parents and children are often altruistic towards each other, why don't you just give a gift back and forth and get infinite utility? A logic of appropriateness would just say, oh, there's a cultural custom where you give a gift on Christmas, and you don't give the gift back because that does something to, but this is an example where hyper-rationality criticisms could be levied, attempting to model gift giving, which is something that is done and is a very big, fun literature. So the solution, create a model of agents that is both rule governed and rational. As an aside, there's a very cool macroeconomic literature on something called hand-to-mouth consumption, where you have a set of poor agents, effectively. They can also be rich agents, but oftentimes you have like a set of poor agents in a society that simply consume their income because of their low wealth. And this is not rational behavior. They just consume what they get. And then you have a bunch of other agents that are rational. Rational, not in any pejorative sense, just they make decisions based upon utility. And this has a lot of interesting implications for policy. But these are rule-based agents in a system with rational agents, and you get a lot of cool things that come out. Finally, she mentions institutions and cultural traditions. Institution-free models are not necessary to have a robust rational choice theory, as I think as Ostrom would agree, even though that was an ambition, I think, and probably still is an ambition of many rational choice theorists and economists. She has this quote: institutional structures help explain behavior that appears to be irrational upon first inspection, a la the gift giving, and even car driving, right? If you wanted to model cars, you might think, well, maybe the agent wants to minimize the time that the car takes to go to someplace. Why is it stopping? Why doesn't it turn and run over the parking lot at Arby's? Yeah, so history and culture can be a case, can basically be used to understand how the rules of the game are actually defined. And then of course I mentioned Ostrom's law: a resource arrangement that works in practice can work in theory, the clarion call of my profession. So that's all I had. If you guys have any thoughts, please yell at me. I hope I did some justice to the paper, Daniel.
Yes, you did. Very nice, Chandler. Thank you. Anybody have any comments or observations?
Yeah, I have a question about one of the things that struck me thinking about the march and, oh, there's clapping. I should have clapped first. I'm so sorry.
It's fine.
The March and Olson bit where they talk about the idea that we do this post-decision justification using the logic of consequentiality. And I wonder whether or not a kind of critique that you could poke at that is that that's actually a social norm, that we're required to do this consequentialist justification afterwards. So is that actually an example of an appropriate, a sort of decision based on appropriateness, where it's appropriate for us to justify our decisions in a highly individualist society based on a rationality model?
I think that's precisely what Olson. So Olson and I keep forgetting Olson and March. I think they would definitely say that because they don't want to explain behavior. They don't want the, from what I understand, they don't want the explanation to come from the rational choice approach. They want the reason for your behavior to be the reason, as in the actual cause of your behavior, to be due to these rules. So I think that's exactly what they'd say.
I actually found this really hard to read, given that I hadn't read any of the books it was reviewing. I don't know if anybody else felt that way, but like of the things that we read, this was definitely the one I struggled through the most. So it was really helpful to have you go through that again.
There was definitely a vocab issue that struck me while I was reading it. Lots of Googling.
So I've got 2 or 3 comments, or just kind of elaborations on your very fine presentation. and I think they're almost like labels. It's useful, that would be useful for all of us to have in mind. Imperfections of rationality. I don't think any of us has mentioned, I don't think the readings have yet mentioned Kahneman and Tversky. So Kahneman and Tversky are two, well, actually they're two psychologists slash economists, Israeli, right after World War II. And they made their life, you mentioned experimental economics or behavioral economics, and they were kind of the founders of behavioral economics. But what they demonstrated is that routine, ordinary human decision-making does not conform to the axioms, the pure axioms of economic rationality in fairly specific ways, overestimating bad consequences. So being concerned about air crashes, but not road crashes. So you might be afraid of flying, but you're willing to drive to Chicago. And yet the actual risk of dying in an air accident from here to Chicago is like 1/100th the likelihood of being killed in a car accident. So what they find is that ordinary human reasoners overestimate the importance of very small probability, but very high impact, high negative risks. Like their view is that opposition to nuclear power is an example of this kind of irrationality that, other people don't agree with that. But anyway, I'm just kind of introducing the idea of Kahneman and Tversky, and the idea that is common in behavioral economics, that ordinary human decision-making is more complicated than economic rationality would suggest. That was one point. There's a kind of related point, which I think is related to the March argument also, but it's the idea of myopic decision-making. So there's, to optimize requires that you be far-sighted, that you be able to foresee all of the possible consequences and then choose that action which has the best possible consequences. But actually, ordinary human reasoners, we have to make myopic decisions. We have to make today's decisions today and tomorrow's decisions tomorrow. And that imposes a pretty different logic on life choices or kind of repeated play choices in any kind of decision-making problem, which again maybe it's not so relevant to economics, but it's hugely relevant to Elun's kind of problem. Why do individuals mobilize in political movements, let's say? Well, the idea of myopic decision-making, meaning making a decision today because the circumstances today justify that decision, even though, if you really thought through all the consequences, on day 100, this might be a really bad choice, but we can't really think forward to day 100. So the idea of myopic or kind of short-range decision-making, I think, is a relevant one. Again, something I probably should have mentioned, it's relevant to your presentation of Ostrom, but it's the fact, it's kind of the distinction between parametric rationality and strategic rationality. So parametric rationality is defined as rational choice about outcomes and probabilities. It's playing against nature. And strategic rationality is completely different. Do you remember well, you don't remember, you're all young. That's the trouble with students. But during Star Wars, and I don't mean the movie, I mean Ronald Reagan's version of Star Wars. Ronald Reagan was a huge fan of the idea of anti-missile defense. And scientists said, this is a fool's errand. We can't do anti-missile defense. It's not technically feasible. He said, well, I don't get that. If we can land a man on the moon, then we should be able to shoot down a couple hundred missiles. And the answer was, the moon doesn't fight back. In other words, missile defense is a strategic rationality problem, whereas landing a human being on the moon is a parametric rationality decision problem. We know exactly where the moon will be, whereas the missiles, it was very easy, in 1980 for the Soviets to realize, okay, their plan is to shoot down our missiles as soon as they enter the atmosphere, and they're going to heat track us by the hot fuels coming off the engines. Here's a plan. Let's turn off the engines before we re-enter the, in other words, countermeasures were possible. That's an example, just a really very mundane example of strategic rationality, strategic interaction. Game theory is the theory of rational decision-making under conditions of strategic interaction, where I can't just bet that Chandler is going to favor scissors all the time. Instead, I need to reason what Chandler's strategies are, knowing that Chandler is reasoning about what my strategies are. And it seems iterative in a way that is just insolvable. Well, that was the genius of game theory, was it turned out that problem of strategic deliberation is in fact, under the specified conditions, entirely solvable. Yeah, you were going to amplify, Chandler.
Yeah, there's this thing called K-level rationality. It's really cool. It's sort of the idea of a zero-level rational agent presumes that you're just perfectly predictable. You won't adjust at all. But then you have that's a 0 level, and you have a 1 level, which is you presume that they presume you're rational. And then it's just how many levels of do you presume that I presume, do you presume? Mm-hmm. It's really funny.
Right. Yeah, it's that iterative kind of nested. And that's really where the idea of equilibrium is most relevant. There are equilibria in microeconomics, but the powerful idea of equilibrium is in game theory and is in strategic rationality, where you have a portfolio of strategies which matches with my portfolio of strategies, which is such that even if I knew your strategies, I would still not change my strategy. The prisoner's dilemma is one which is described, I guess it's described in the Coleman chapter that you read. He doesn't call it, well, eventually he calls it the prisoner's dilemma, but when he introduces it, he doesn't introduce it as the prisoner's dilemma. But it's a kind of a paradox of rationality in the sense that it's an instance where by behaving in a purely self-interested way, two competing / collaborating partners are rationally forced to choose a pair of strategies which leave them worse off than if they were both to collaborate, both to cooperate with each other. And it's perfectly visible to both of them. This is exactly what's going to happen. We're both going to get screwed because we're both going to go with the defect strategy. But if my opponent makes a stupid mistake and decides to cooperate, I do even better. That is kind of the logic of the prisoner's dilemma. And many social arrangements have the structure of a prisoner's dilemma. I think you made a point, Chandler, that, it was the point about individual rationality doesn't necessarily lead to collective rationality. That is illustrated by the prisoner's dilemma, kind of modeling that what's best for the individual to choose, often aggregates to a suboptimal outcome. Collective action problems and Menker-Olson, the logic of collective action. Again, I wanted to mention that, but it's another instance. It's probably an instance of the same thing, the instance of prisoner's dilemma. But it's what Olson demonstrated in the 1960s is that sociologists believed that groups would behave in their interest. So dentists will come together over a lobbying strategy that favors dentists. It seems kind of logical. Groups will pursue their interests. But what Olson demonstrated in a way that is completely consistent with Coleman, he demonstrated, no, each individual dentist will decide, he's forced to decide, will I contribute or not contribute, given that the whole profession is not determined by what I do. So shall I become a contributor, a fool, where I make the private contribution, it costs me $1,000 to join the association, and we are successful and we get the benefit, except I get the benefit less the $1,000, or shall I be a free rider and hope that the collaboration works? And in any case, I'm not out the $1,000. Well, that's the free rider problem. It's what Olson demonstrated to be the defect in kind of a certain kind of pop sociological reasoning, that groups automatically do what's in their interest. He demonstrated that's just simply not true. Labor unions don't do what's in their interest. Social classes don't do, but also groups of ministers don't do what's in their best interest as a group. Rather, individual ministers, individual clergy do what's in the individual clergy person's interest, but that aggregates to not performing collective action, not being successful in their collective action. So in other words, I guess I'm kind of piling on to your terrific presentation with a couple of related ideas, which I think are very relevant for the kind of sociological / social explanation questions which we are most concerned about. There's one final point I want to make, and it's on behalf of rational choice theory. If you were to be involved in a betting game with a good probability calculator, then if you are not also a good probability calculator, you're going to be taken to the cleaners. Because if I don't know any card games at all, but if you are miscounting how many aces of clubs there are, I believe there's just one in a deck, but if you are miscalculating the probability of a card to occur and then betting accordingly, the better informed person with a better assessment of the probabilities will be able to win, more than his share of bets against you. I think is that called the Dutch book? There's something called the Dutch book paradox. I forget exactly how it's defined, but it's something about taking advantage of the person who is not behaving according to the expected utility rule. If you have for example, you mentioned lexicographical preference orderings. If a person has a lexicographical preference ordering, then it's pretty easy to bet against that person and take their whole fortune from them. Well, how cool that was. You guys both of you, Lucas and Chandler, you both did very nice presentations today. And it adds so much to have, you taking the time and putting together a nice presentation like that. So my hat's off to both of you. Thank you very much. It was a great start. I don't think as of this afternoon, anyone was signed up for next week. It would be great if someone did, but it's not mandatory. We'll have plenty to talk about. But if you haven't signed up for your quota of presentations, you might consider doing a presentation next week. And this is the perfect time to say, I wish you a healthy coming week. Oh, I will have to share with you, I lost the vaccination lottery this week. People in my age group were invited to get vaccinated this week. My wife was invited, my best friend was invited, but I was not invited. So I'm a loser in that competition, but I'm hopeful that in the next round, I'll be a winner. Nobody wants to be a loser in this particular competition. Okay.
For the rest of
go
us.
ahead. Yeah. Yeah, Emily.
I know, I was just laughing. I assume many of you also had to fill in the form for like when you're going to get your vaccination. And for many of us, filling it in is just a sort of exercise in how close to the bottom of the list can I become.
Well, I don't know about that form. I know about the blue Q questionnaire. That's how faculty and staff.
Yeah, that's the one I had to fill in.
Is that what you're referring to though?
Yeah. So like, do you have any conditions? No. I'm going down another 10 weeks. Do you have any this? No. Are you under a certain age limit?
Yes. Well, I'm very happy to say I qualify for the age limit. So that was why I was sort of expecting to win the lottery, but I'm sure it'll work out soon. And I certainly hope you all take appropriate precautions and stay safe and healthy. And I really enjoyed today. I think today was a good discussion, a bunch of good ideas. So thank you. See you next week.
Thank you.
Good.
Super, thank you.
Jun Chao, I'm going to send you a response in just a minute.
Yeah, hi Dan. I kind of guess what you will say when you talk about comments, but yeah.
Yeah, actually, we can talk now if you want. Let me, if you would like. I don't want to take longer. Yeah, let me. So thinking about what we mean when we say we have an actor-centered philosophy of social science, does it mean that every good social science theory should explicitly have an actor component? Does it mean good social science should in principle be compatible? That's a really excellent question. I kind of paraphrase that as the micro foundations question. Does an explanation need to have explicit micro foundations? Or what I now favor, I used to say, yes, it needs to have explicit micro foundations. What I now say is we need to have a good basis of confidence for believing the micro foundations exist, but we don't need to reproduce them. That's the, so I would call that a more liberalized view of micro foundations. We don't want magical social causation. That's what we're trying to avoid. But is it reciprocal? Does it mean that good social science should be in principle compatible? I think it's actually the actor-centered, the idea is that when we're considering a sociological or an economic issue, we should be kind of actively thinking about how do actors in concrete circumstances, I don't mean, tell the whole story, but how do actors in concrete circumstances behave in such a way as to bring about the outcome? So when Eleanor Ostrom, whom we were just hearing about, when she says in Spain, there was a 200-year tradition of management of forest resources, which conserved forest resources, contrary to the tragedy of the commons. An actor-centered approach would ask, so how did that work? What kind of circumstances would lead individuals in different villages in the forest to comply? In general terms, what are the mechanisms? So I think it's a little bit more than knowing in principle, there needs to be an actor embodiment, and we should actually give a little bit of thought to what that embodiment might be without feeling like we've got to actually say in detail. That's the level of disaggregation that I'm kind of thinking of. Now I'm looking at your second comment. I'm asking, not every social phenomena can be immediately tested at an individual actor level. I agree with that, that's true. World system, which emphasizes worldwide division of labor. French structuralism, which says some mysterious underlying symbolic codes decide everything. They do not have an immediate actor component. Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I would say that's what the disqualifying defect of French structuralism is that it distinctly refuses to consider how it might be embodied. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that makes sense. But I can think of like, well, French structuralism is cannot do that. But I can think of like Marxism or work system theory can be interpreted in some way to be compatible with the micro foundation.
Yeah. So yeah. Absolutely, I agree with you completely. That Wallerstein, that we can tell a story about Wallerstein's world system theory, which is a disaggregated theory down to companies and individuals in Indonesia and in Britain. In other words, I think that world system theory is compatible with an actor-centered approach. What isn't so, though actually I had an interesting experience years and years ago. I gave a lecture at Northwestern, and I said the problem with Wallerstein is that Wallerstein thinks that world system just mysteriously causes things to happen, but that's just magical thinking. And a young man in the audience said, I don't think that's what my uncle believes. So this was the nephew of Emanuel Wallerstein. He was a political science professor at Northwestern. It was really funny. Really funny. But I do believe, as you apparently do, that world system theory, though you think about it differently if you think, in order to make the claim, the world system approach tells us something about Indonesia and France and Britain. If you don't think, I need to know something about those trading networks, and I need to know something about the incentives and the companies and the organizational structures, if you don't think those things, then you're in some risk of being too abstract.
Yeah, I got you. I think that's quite close to my own thinking about that. And well, then I do have another question, kind of related, but I think we can continue discussion to next week. It's about like, so the readings this week, including Coleman and RCT and Hallström DBO theory, they all try to build a very abstract theory with several elements, which tries to integrate all the elements of basic social action. So they try to apply this theory as widely as possible, but that's a little different from what sociologists mostly are doing. They are trying to build like single factor or single mechanism, which emphasize, well, this is what theory, like organization institutionalism, which emphasize legitimacy mechanism or something like that. So I'm thinking of, so I know economists like to like the grand abstract accumulative theory, but I'm just thinking about like, do we need a very abstract theory which covers everything, or do we just need like varieties of meso level like theories, like
Right.
what Burton tells us?
So my own orientation is the second point. It's kind of methodological, theoretical pluralism. That it's kind of like Merton's view of mid-level, whatever you call it, mid-level,
Mid-range theory.
mid-range theory. But it's the idea that there are multiple causal processes at work in the social world. And for any of those processes, we can tell a kind of a disaggregated social actor story. But that it's fine. We shouldn't even imagine that there's a single unified theory to which everything is reducible. To me, it's not a good basis for sociological research. A better basis is to be a little open-minded. I mean, I think, for example, about China, about trying to understand the changes that are underway in China over the past 20 years or 30 years. And there isn't any existing sociological theory that sheds very much light. Rather, there are multiple mechanisms, some political, some sociological, some economic, some demographic, some unintended consequences from one-child policy. It's just a mix of a whole bunch of contingent causal factors, some intentional, some not intentional. And to do a good job of sociology of China, you really need to be thinking about multiple causal processes, I think.
Yeah, that's why as a sociologist, I feel quite a little bored about Coleman's and Hallström, what they are trying to do to build a grand theory which covers everything. Yeah.
Yes, no, I completely agree with you. You might find it interesting. There's a post in my blog on, it's basically on a sociology for China. I should be able to, I don't know, maybe I'll see if I can find the post and I'll send it an email to you. And if you're interested, the beauty of a post is it's 1,000 words. It's not a lot of reading, but it kind of expresses the idea that we shouldn't expect there's a theory that illuminates China's itinerary. Instead, we need to consider the kind of contingent historical circumstances which have led from revolution and economic change and cultural revolution and many contingent factors which lead us to the present, but the present is going somewhere else. And there are many changes that China will undergo that are right now unpredictable, I think.
I would appreciate it if you send me the link. Yeah, I know you have written a book on that, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll send you a link.
Thanks. And I'm all set. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, nice talking to you. I'm glad we could talk for a minute afterwards.
See you. Yeah.
Great.
See you next week.
Yeah. Bye-bye.